Everyone knows the names. Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, John Gotti. These men built empires on violence, corruption, and fear, their stories etched into the annals of criminal history with blood and bullets. But what if I told you that decades before these mobsters ever drew their first breath, a criminal organization operated with such precision, such sophistication, that they made modern organized crime look almost amateurish by comparison? Picture London, 1870. Gas lamps flicker against cobblestone streets. Victorian society operates under strict rules of propriety and class. Women are expected to be demure, submissive, invisible. But in the shadows of this rigidly structured world, something unprecedented is taking shape. A criminal network so brilliantly concealed that it would operate for over a century, largely undetected by the authorities who should have been hunting them down. This wasn't a gang. It was an institution. A multi-generational empire built on intelligence, innovation, and an understanding of human psychology that wouldn't be formally studied for another 50 years. They had training academies, international fencing operations, retirement programs, a hierarchical structure with clear chains of command. They even had what we'd now call corporate espionage divisions and research and development departments. And here's the twist that makes this story almost impossible to believe. They were women. Not just any women, but working-class girls from the slums of South London who transformed themselves into the most successful organized criminals of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The 40 Elephants. The name sounds almost whimsical, doesn't it? Like something from a children's storybook. But to the shopkeepers of London's West End, to the jewelry merchants of Bond Street, to the department store magnates who watched their profits evaporate, this name meant something else entirely: terror. Financial ruin. An enemy they couldn't see, couldn't catch, and couldn't stop. While history remembers male gangsters with a mixture of fear and fascination, the 40 Elephants have been almost completely erased from our collective memory. Why? Perhaps because their story challenges everything we think we know about Victorian women. Perhaps because acknowledging their sophistication would mean admitting that organized crime as we understand it wasn't invented in Prohibition-era America, but perfected in the drawing rooms and department stores of Victorian London. These weren't desperate women committing crimes of survival. This was organized, strategic, and breathtakingly ambitious. They targeted the wealthiest establishments in London, walking out with thousands of pounds worth of goods, the equivalent of millions today, while police officers literally held doors open for them. They operated across international borders, with fencing operations in Paris, New York, and Amsterdam. They had lawyers on retainer, politicians in their pockets, and a code of silence that would make the Mafia's omerta look like casual gossip. But perhaps most remarkably, they passed their criminal expertise down through generations, like a family business. Mothers trained daughters, aunts recruited nieces. A girl born into the 40 Elephants in 1880 might work the streets until 1920, training the next generation, who would continue the operation into the 1950s. We're talking about an organization that spanned nearly a century of continuous criminal activity. How did they do it? How did a group of women, the most scrutinized, restricted, and controlled demographic of Victorian society, build and maintain a criminal empire that operated with more efficiency than most legitimate businesses of their era? How did they steal from the most secure locations in London without ever using violence, without ever being caught in the act? The answer lies in understanding something that Victorian society refused to acknowledge. Women were capable of far more than anyone imagined. And in the dark heart of South London, in the notorious Elephant and Castle district, a group of brilliant, ruthless women turned society's underestimation of them into the ultimate criminal advantage. This is their story. A tale of ambition, innovation, and criminal genius that history tried to forget. The Elephant and Castle. Even the name carries weight in London's criminal history. This South London district, named after a pub that once stood at its heart, was Victorian England's pressure cooker, a place where poverty, desperation, and ambition collided in streets that reeked of coal smoke and human struggle. It was here, in the 1870s, that something extraordinary began to take shape. The area belonged to the Elephant and Castle mob, a predominantly male criminal gang that controlled the underworld of South London. They ran protection rackets, organized illegal boxing matches, controlled gambling dens, and maintained their power through brutal violence. But within this violent, testosterone-fueled organization, a subset emerged that would eventually eclipse the parent gang in both sophistication and profitability: the 40 Elephants. The exact origins remain shrouded in mystery, lost to time and the deliberate efforts of the women themselves to avoid documentation. What we know suggests the gang coalesced in the late 1860s or early 1870s, when several female relatives and associates of male gang members began coordinating their criminal activities. Initially, they worked as pickpockets and small-time thieves, but someone, we may never know who, recognized an opportunity that the male criminals had completely overlooked. Victorian society had created the perfect conditions for an invisible crime wave. The rapidly expanding middle and upper classes were obsessed with consumption and display. New department stores were opening across London: Harrods, Selfridges, Liberty. Palatial shopping destinations that showcased wealth in a way the world had never seen. These weren't simple shops. They were temples of capitalism, with soaring ceilings, elaborate displays, and most importantly, an overwhelming volume of merchandise that made inventory tracking nearly impossible. And who frequented these establishments? Women, respectable ladies from good families, accompanied by their maids and companions, spending hours browsing through silks, jewelry, furs, and luxury goods. The stores encouraged this behavior, creating comfortable lounges, offering tea services, making shopping itself a form of entertainment. The 40 Elephants saw what the male criminals couldn't: an entire world that men couldn't effectively access or understand. A world where women moved freely, where their presence was expected and welcomed, where their shopping bags and packages drew no suspicion. The department store wasn't just a target. It was an opportunity for criminal innovation on a scale that had never been attempted. But simple shoplifting wasn't going to build an empire. What the 40 Elephants developed was something far more sophisticated. They created what we'd now call a professional training program. Young girls, often recruited as young as 12 or 13, entered an apprenticeship system that would have impressed any legitimate trade guild. The training was exhaustive and methodical. New recruits learned to walk differently, speak differently, dress differently. They studied the mannerisms of upper-class women, how they held their hands, how they addressed shop assistants, the subtle social signals that marked someone as belonging to the respectable classes. They memorized the layouts of dozens of stores, learning the sight lines, the blind spots, the exact positions of mirrors and sales staff. They were taught the art of distraction, working in coordinated teams, where one woman would engage a clerk in detailed questions about merchandise, while others systematically emptied displays into specially designed clothing. These weren't crude pockets sewn into skirts. These were engineering marvels. Weighted hems that hung naturally despite being loaded with jewelry. Corsets with hidden compartments. Crinolines modified to create vast storage spaces beneath seemingly respectable Victorian dresses. The psychological training was equally important. These women learned to project absolute confidence and entitlement. They studied accents, practiced the casual arrogance of wealth, learned to make shop assistants feel privileged to serve them. A 40 Elephant in action didn't slink or hurry or show nervousness. She browsed leisurely, made small talk, sometimes even returned the next day to purchase something small, establishing herself as a legitimate customer. But the true genius of their operation went beyond technique. The 40 Elephants understood something about Victorian society that even the authorities failed to grasp: class trumped suspicion. A well-dressed woman speaking with a refined accent was essentially invisible to scrutiny. Shop assistants, police officers, even witnesses who might have seen something unusual, all of them would dismiss their suspicions rather than accuse a lady of theft. The organization grew rapidly. By the 1880s, They had dozens of active members and were operating across London and beyond. They had developed a sophisticated support network that included fences who could move high-value goods, lawyers who could intervene if a member was arrested, and corrupt officials who could make evidence disappear. Every empire needs an architect. Every revolution requires a visionary. And in the shadowy world of the 40 Elephants, that visionary was a woman whose name has been almost completely erased from historical records, known to us only through court documents and police reports as Mary Carr. Mary emerged as the gang's leader sometime in the 1880s, though her rise to power remains as mysterious as the woman herself. What we know paints a portrait of someone who possessed a rare combination of ruthless ambition and strategic brilliance. She wasn't the strongest or the most physically imposing member of the gang. She didn't need to be. Mary understood something that would define organized crime for the next century. True power comes not from violence, but from organization, intelligence, and the ability to think 10 steps ahead of your enemies. Under Mary's leadership, the 40 Elephants transformed from a successful criminal gang into something unprecedented. A criminal corporation with structure, hierarchy, and long-term strategic planning. She implemented a ranking system that mirrored legitimate business organizations. At the top sat the Queen, Mary herself, who made strategic decisions, approved major operations, and settled internal disputes. Below her were senior members, experienced thieves, who had proven themselves over years of successful operations. These women served as team leaders, each commanding a small group of active thieves. Then came the workers, the women who actually executed the thefts. And finally, the apprentices, young girls learning the trade under the watchful eyes of their seniors. But Mary's organizational genius went far beyond simple hierarchy. She understood that sustainability required investment in your people, something almost unheard of in the criminal underworld of the 1880s. She established what we might call a social safety net. Members who were arrested received financial support for their families while they served their sentences. Women who became pregnant or too old to work the streets received pensions, paid from the gang's collective earnings. This wasn't generosity, it was strategic brilliance. It ensured loyalty. It meant that no member would be tempted to inform on the organization in exchange for leniency, because they knew their families would be cared for regardless. Mary also recognized that the biggest threat to any criminal organization is internal betrayal. She implemented a code of silence that was enforced with social and economic consequences rather than violence. A woman who talked to police would find herself completely ostracized, unable to find work, housing, or support in the close-knit communities of South London where the 40 Elephants held sway. Her family would suffer the same fate. For women living in poverty, this social death sentence was often more terrifying than physical punishment. But perhaps Mary's most innovative contribution was her expansion strategy. She understood that London, as vast as it was, had limits. Shop owners were beginning to compare notes. Police were becoming more attentive. The solution? Geographic diversification. Under Mary's direction, the 40 Elephants began sending teams to other cities: Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, even Edinburgh. These weren't random raids. They were carefully planned operations, with advanced scouts sent weeks ahead to study local stores, identify fencing opportunities, and establish escape routes. The teams would arrive, execute a series of coordinated thefts over several days, and vanish before local authorities even realized they'd been targeted. Mary established relationships with criminal networks in Paris and New York, creating an international fencing operation that could move stolen goods across borders. A diamond necklace stolen in London might surface in a Parisian jewelry shop within a week, its origins completely obscured. Rare furs taken from a Manchester department store could end up adorning a wealthy New York socialite. The transaction filtered through so many intermediaries that tracing it became impossible. The profits were staggering. While exact figures are impossible to verify, police estimates from the 1890s suggest the 40 Elephants were stealing goods worth tens of thousands of pounds annually, the equivalent of several million pounds in today's currency. And unlike the male gangs who spent their money on conspicuous displays of wealth that inevitably drew police attention, Mary insisted on discretion. Members were forbidden from wearing or displaying stolen goods. The profits were carefully laundered through legitimate businesses, boarding houses, laundries, small shops, that provided both income and cover stories. Several senior members of the gang became legitimate businesswomen, their criminal earnings giving them the capital to establish respectable enterprises that, ironically, employed other working-class women from their communities. Mary herself remained almost ghostly in her discretion. She dressed modestly, lived in a nondescript house in Southwark, and avoided any behavior that might draw attention. To her neighbors, she was simply a widow who ran a small boarding house and occasionally helped young women find employment. They had no idea they were living next door to the mastermind of England's most successful criminal organization. But Mary understood something that many criminal leaders throughout history have failed to grasp. The higher you rise, the more vulnerable you become. By the early 1890s, she began grooming her successor, passing along not just the practical knowledge of theft and fencing, but the strategic thinking and organizational skills that had built the empire. She was preparing for the future, ensuring that the 40 elephants would outlive her. To understand the 40 elephants' success, you have to understand that they didn't just commit crimes, they engineered them. Every theft was a calculated operation, planned with the precision of a military campaign and executed with the finesse of a theatrical performance. What looked like spontaneous shoplifting was actually the culmination of weeks of preparation, reconnaissance, and rehearsal. The process began long before any member set foot in a Target store. Intelligence gathering was the foundation of every operation. The 40 elephants maintained an extensive network of informants, chambermaids who worked in wealthy households, seamstresses who knew which families were ordering new wardrobes, even employees within the department stores themselves who could provide insider information about security measures, high-value inventory, and staff schedules. These informants were carefully cultivated and generously compensated. A housemaid who mentioned that her employer had just purchased an expensive pearl necklace might receive enough money to cover a month's wages. This wasn't just payment, it was investment. The 40 elephants understood that reliable information was worth far more than the cost of obtaining it. Once a target was identified, the real work began. Scout teams would visit the store multiple times over several weeks, never stealing anything, simply observing. They mapped the physical layout with obsessive detail. Where were the mirrors positioned? Which displays could be accessed without being seen from a sales counter? How many staff members worked each shift? What time of day was busiest? They noted which employees were attentive and which were lazy, which clerks could be distracted with conversation, and which required different tactics. They studied the merchandise itself. How were expensive items secured? Were there serial numbers or identifying marks? Which pieces could be easily concealed, and which were too large or distinctive? They learned the value of different goods, understanding that a small diamond brooch might be worth more than a large fur coat, while being infinitely easier to transport and fence. The 40 elephants also developed an intricate understanding of Victorian fashion, turning it into a criminal tool. The era's clothing was elaborate, layered, and voluminous, a thief's dream. But the gang took it several steps further, employing skilled seamstresses to create custom garments specifically designed for theft. Picture a seemingly ordinary Victorian dress. To any observer, it appeared perfectly respectable, expensive fabric, proper styling, exactly what a middle-class woman might wear for an afternoon of shopping. But hidden within its construction were dozens of secret compartments. The bodice contained pockets lined with soft fabric to prevent jewelry from clinking together. The bustle, that fashionable padding that gave Victorian skirts their distinctive shape, was actually a removable bag capable of holding dozens of stolen items. The sleeves had elastic openings at the wrists that allowed items to be slipped up and held in place against the arm. Some dresses featured false panels that could be opened and closed with hidden clasps, creating storage space between the outer fabric and the lining. Petticoats were modified with weighted hems, that hung naturally even when loaded with merchandise. The women wore specially designed corsets with compartments built into the boning, capable of concealing everything from silk scarves to small pieces of jewelry. But the garments were only part of the equation. The 40 elephants developed what would later be recognized as classic distraction techniques, refined to an art form. They worked in teams, with each member playing a specific role choreographed in advance. The customer would enter first, dressed impeccably, speaking with a refined accent, projecting absolute confidence. She would engage a sales clerk in detailed conversation about merchandise, asking to see multiple items, discussing quality and price, behaving exactly like a legitimate wealthy customer. While the clerk's attention was completely focused on serving this demanding client, 2 or 3 other gang members would enter separately, dressed more modestly, appearing to browse independently. These were the lifters, the actual thieves. While the customer kept the staff occupied, they systematically emptied displays into their modified clothing. The key was appearing casual, unhurried, completely natural. A skilled lifter could palm a piece of jewelry, slip it into a hidden pocket, and continue browsing without breaking stride. They never looked around nervously, never rushed, never did anything that might trigger suspicion. Meanwhile, a 4th member, the lookout, would position herself near the entrance, watching for security or police. If danger appeared, she would execute a predetermined signal. It might be adjusting her hat, dropping a handkerchief, or mentioning a specific phrase in conversation. The signal would ripple through the team in seconds, and the operation would abort smoothly, with members drifting out separately, appearing for all the world like ordinary shoppers who simply hadn't found what they wanted. The timing was crucial. Most operations lasted no more than 15 to 20 minutes. Any longer increased the risk of detection. The customer would eventually make a small purchase, establishing legitimacy and providing a reason for her extended presence, and leave. The lifters would depart separately, at staggered intervals, never together, never in a way that suggested coordination. Stealing the goods was only half the equation. The 40 elephants had mastered the art of the theft, but their true genius lay in what happened afterward. A distribution network so sophisticated that it wouldn't look out of place in a modern international smuggling operation. The challenge was simple yet daunting. How do you convert thousands of pounds worth of stolen luxury goods into untraceable cash without drawing attention from authorities? The answer required building an infrastructure that spanned oceans and operated in the shadows of legitimate commerce. Immediately after a successful operation, the stolen goods would disappear into what the gang called hoisting houses, safe locations scattered across London where merchandise could be temporarily stored and sorted. These weren't obvious criminal hideouts. They were ordinary boarding houses, laundries, millinery shops, even respectable townhouses owned by retired members of the gang or their relatives. To any observer, they were legitimate businesses operated by respectable working-class women. But in back rooms and hidden cellars, a different kind of business was conducted. Senior gang members would examine each stolen item, categorizing them by type, value, and risk level. Items with distinguishing marks or serial numbers required special handling. Jewelry would be broken down, stones removed from their settings, and settings melted down. Distinctive pieces might be held for months or even years before being sold, allowing time for the heat to dissipate and memories to fade. The 40 elephants maintained relationships with dozens of fences throughout England, but their most valuable connections were international. This is where the operation transcended ordinary theft and became something approaching modern organized crime. In Paris, the gang worked with a network of seemingly respectable antique dealers and jewelry merchants who specialized in acquiring goods without questions. A diamond bracelet stolen from Harrods on Monday might be in a Parisian jewelry shop by Friday, its provenance obscured through false documentation and strategic recutting of stones. The French connection was particularly valuable because it placed an international border between the crime and the sale, making police investigation exponentially more difficult. The Atlantic crossing opened even more opportunities. New York in the 1880s and 1890s was experiencing explosive growth, with newly wealthy industrialists eager to display their prosperity through European luxury goods. The 40 Elephants established connections with import businesses that brought European antiques and jewelry into America. Mixed in with legitimate goods would be items stolen in London, their origins completely obscured by the time they reached American shores. The system worked through layers of intermediaries, each knowing only their immediate contacts, creating a buffer that protected the core organization. A fence in London might pass goods to a ship's steward, who supplemented his income through smuggling. The steward would deliver the items to a contact in New York who operated a seemingly legitimate import business. That business would sell to retailers who had no idea they were dealing in stolen goods. By the time a stolen necklace adorned a wealthy American woman's neck, it had passed through so many hands that tracing it back to a London department store theft was virtually impossible. But the international operation required something that many criminal organizations lack: patience and strategic thinking. The 40 Elephants understood that flooding the market with stolen goods would crash prices and draw attention. Instead, they operated on what we might call a steady-state model, releasing merchandise into their fencing network at a controlled pace that maintained high prices and avoided saturating any single market. They also diversified their fencing operations based on the type of goods stolen. High-end jewelry went through the international network, where prices were highest and documentation easiest to forge. Luxury fabrics and furs moved through a different channel, often sold to dressmakers and tailors who catered to middle-class customers who wanted quality goods at below retail prices and didn't ask uncomfortable questions. Smaller items like gloves, accessories, and perfumes moved through street markets and small shops in working-class neighborhoods. The financial architecture was equally sophisticated. The 40 Elephants didn't operate on a simple cash basis. They maintained what amounted to a banking system, with senior members acting as financial managers. Money from fencing operations would be collected, recorded in coded ledgers, and distributed according to a predetermined formula. Active thieves received the largest share, with percentages also going to support staff, informants, and the organization's reserve fund. This reserve fund was crucial. It covered legal fees when members were arrested, supported families during imprisonment, and provided capital for legitimate business ventures that served as both money laundering operations and genuine sources of income. Several senior gang members used their criminal profits to open legitimate shops, boarding houses, and other businesses that employed other working-class women from their communities, creating a complex web where legal and illegal activities intertwined. The gang also employed what we now recognize as money laundering techniques decades before the term existed. Large sums of cash would be broken into smaller amounts and deposited through multiple people into different banks. Money would be lent out at interest through informal lending networks, returning as apparently legitimate loan repayments. It would be used to purchase property that could then be rented out, converting criminal proceeds into respectable rental income. Communication across this vast network required its own innovations. The 40 Elephants developed coded systems for written correspondence, using seemingly innocent letters about family matters or business transactions that actually contained detailed instructions about operations, shipments, and payments. They utilized trusted couriers, often elderly women or children who appeared completely innocent, to carry messages and small valuable items between locations. The heart of the 40 Elephants operation wasn't found in the glittering department stores of the West End or the shadowy streets of South London. It beat quietly in a network of seemingly ordinary establishments scattered across the city. The hoisting houses, where stolen goods transformed into profit and Victorian respectability masked criminal enterprise. Take number 47 Lambeth Walk, for instance. To any passerby in the 1880s, it appeared to be exactly what its sign advertised: a modest boarding house operated by a widow named Mrs. Elizabeth Rayner. The front parlor served tea to respectable lodgers. The upper floors housed working-class families who paid their rent on time and caused no trouble. Local constables occasionally stopped by for a cup of tea. chatting amiably with Mrs. Rayner about neighborhood gossip. What those constables never saw was the cellar accessed through a hidden door in the kitchen pantry. Down those steps, in a space lit by oil lamps and lined with shelves, thousands of pounds worth of stolen merchandise waited to be processed, valued, and distributed. On any given night, you might find diamond bracelets lying next to bolts of stolen silk, for stoles hanging alongside strings of pearls, all carefully cataloged in ledgers that used coded notations impossible for outsiders to decipher. Mrs. Rayner was a retired lifter, a woman who had worked the stores for 2 decades before age, and the accumulated risk of recognition made active theft too dangerous. But the 40 elephants didn't discard valuable members simply because their street-level usefulness had expired. Instead, they promoted from within, elevating experienced members to management positions that utilized their knowledge while keeping them safely away from the actual crime scenes. The hoisting houses operated according to strict protocols, developed over years of trial and error. Stolen goods never arrived openly. Active thieves would leave a store, take circuitous routes through London streets, changing omnibuses multiple times, ducking through alleyways and markets, ensuring no one could possibly follow them to their destination. They entered hoisting houses separately, at different times, through different doors, front entrances, back gardens, even neighboring properties, with connecting passages. Inside, the goods were immediately stripped of any identifying features. Tags were removed and burned. Distinctive packaging was destroyed. Items were sorted by risk level and value. High-risk pieces, those with unique characteristics that might be recognized or traced, went into secure storage, where they might remain for months or even years before being deemed safe to sell. Medium-risk goods were processed more quickly, perhaps moving out within weeks. Low-risk items, generic merchandise without distinguishing features, could be fenced almost immediately. The hoisting houses also served as meeting places where the organization conducted its internal business. Senior members gathered in these secure locations to plan operations, settle disputes, and make strategic decisions. New recruits were interviewed and evaluated here, away from prying eyes. Financial records were maintained in these spaces, with coded ledgers that tracked every theft, every sale, every payment made to members and associates. But perhaps most importantly, the hoisting houses provided something that gave the 40 elephants a decisive advantage over their rivals and the authorities hunting them: institutional memory. While male gangs operated on violence and charisma, often collapsing when their leaders were killed or imprisoned, the 40 elephants built their knowledge into physical spaces and written records. Training occurred in these houses. Experienced thieves would mentor apprentices in back rooms, teaching them not just techniques, but judgment, how to assess risk, read situations, make split-second decisions that meant the difference between success and arrest. They practiced on mock store displays, learning to palm items smoothly, to move with confidence, to project the demeanor of wealthy customers. Mock interrogations prepared members for encounters with police. Senior members would play the role of suspicious constables, teaching younger women how to respond, what to say, how to project innocence and indignation. They learned that the proper response to accusation wasn't denial, but wounded dignity. How dare you suggest such a thing about a respectable woman? The houses maintained reference libraries of sorts, collections of fashion magazines, store catalogs, society pages that helped gang members understand the world they were infiltrating. They studied how wealthy women dressed, spoke, behaved. They learned the names of fashionable resorts, popular restaurants, society events, the casual knowledge that made their performances convincing. Communication between hoisting houses occurred through a courier network that operated with remarkable efficiency. Young girls, often daughters or nieces of gang members, carried messages across London. They appeared completely innocent, children running errands for their mothers, nothing more. But they memorized coded messages, delivered small valuable items concealed in their clothing, and served as the nervous system of the organization, keeping information flowing between different parts of the network. The location of hoisting houses was strategically chosen. They clustered in working-class neighborhoods, where community solidarity ran deep and suspicion of police authority was ingrained. Residents of these areas viewed constables as oppressors rather than protectors, making it unlikely that neighbors would inform on the establishments even if they suspected criminal activity. The 40 Elephants reinforced this loyalty through strategic generosity, helping families in crisis, providing employment, becoming woven into the social fabric of their communities. Some hoisting houses specialized. One might focus on jewelry processing, with skilled craftsmen available to reset stones and melt down precious metals. Another specialized in textile goods, with seamstresses who could alter stolen garments to make them unrecognizable. A third might serve primarily as a financial hub, where the organization's money handlers worked with coded ledgers and carefully managed the flow of criminal proceeds. Detective Inspector Frederick Jarvis stood in the opulent showroom of Harrods on a cold November morning in 1888, staring at a display case that should have contained 12 diamond bracelets valued at over 300 pounds. Instead, it held empty velvet cushions and a mystery that gnawed at him like a physical ache. This was the fourth major theft in as many weeks, all following an identical pattern. High-value items vanished in broad daylight from secure displays. No broken cases, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses who saw anything suspicious. Just goods worth thousands of pounds evaporating as if they'd never existed. Jarvis was among Scotland Yard's most capable investigators, a man who had built his reputation on solving seemingly impossible cases. But this invisible enemy was defeating him, and he wasn't alone. The Metropolitan Police's finest detectives were confronting a frustrating reality. They were being systematically outmaneuvered by criminals they couldn't identify, couldn't catch, and increasingly, couldn't even comprehend. The problem began with Victorian society's fundamental assumptions about women and crime. The Metropolitan Police had been established in 1829 with a clear mental model of what criminals looked like. They were male, lower class, and recognizable by their rough manners and suspicious behavior. Women appeared in police thinking almost exclusively as victims, or, occasionally, as prostitutes and petty thieves operating in the slums. The concept of organized female criminality operating at the level the 40 Elephants had achieved simply didn't fit into the framework through which police understood crime. When Jarvis and his colleagues analyzed theft patterns, they looked for male suspects. When they posted plainclothes officers in stores, those officers watched men, particularly those who appeared working class or foreign. Well-dressed women browsing leisurely through department stores were invisible to police surveillance because they didn't match the profile of criminals. This cognitive blindness was the 40 Elephants' greatest asset. Even when store employees reported suspicions about female customers, police were reluctant to investigate. The social consequences of wrongly accusing a respectable woman of theft were severe: lawsuits for defamation, complaints to superiors, public embarrassment. The 40 Elephants understood this perfectly and exploited it ruthlessly. When gang members were occasionally arrested, the justice system itself became an obstacle to effective law enforcement. Victorian courts treated female defendants with a paternalism that often worked in the criminal's favor. Women received lighter sentences than men for equivalent crimes. Judges and juries were reluctant to believe that women, particularly those who presented themselves well in court, were capable of sophisticated criminal activity. The 40 Elephants prepared their members extensively for court appearances. They hired skilled lawyers who specialized in creating reasonable doubt. They coached arrested members on how to dress, how to speak, how to project wounded innocence. A woman facing charges would appear in court looking like a respectable housewife or shopgirl, often accompanied by character witnesses, other gang members posing as concerned friends or employers, who testified to her good character. Prosecutors faced an uphill battle. Without witnesses who actually saw the theft occur, without physical evidence beyond the stolen goods being found in the defendant's possession, convictions were difficult. And the 40 Elephants rarely made mistakes that left such evidence. Most thefts weren't discovered until after the thieves had long departed. When goods were found on arrested members, skilled defense lawyers argued coincidence, honest purchase from unknown street vendors, gifts from gentlemen friends. Even when convictions were secured, sentences were often laughably light by modern standards. A few months' imprisonment, sometimes just fines. For an organization with financial resources and a support system for members' families, these were acceptable costs of doing business. Women served their sentences, returned to the organization, and went back to work. Detective Jarvis began to suspect something larger than individual shoplifters around 1889, when he started noticing patterns. The same names appeared in reports from different divisions. Women arrested for theft in Kensington had known associates arrested in Southwark. Family connections between suspects suggested organization rather than coincidence. But when he tried to convince his superiors that London faced an organized female criminal network, he encountered institutional resistance. The concept seemed too far-fetched. Senior officers questioned whether Jarvis was becoming obsessed, seeing connections where only coincidence existed. They pointed out that women committing small-scale theft was hardly news. Shoplifting by female customers had been a problem since department stores opened. The idea that these were coordinated operations by a structured criminal organization struck them as implausible. Jarvis's frustration mounted as he accumulated evidence that should have been compelling. He documented connections between arrested women, shared addresses, family relationships, patterns of arrest locations, and methods. He identified what he believed were fencing operations in South London. He even infiltrated the Elephant and Castle area with informants, trying to gather intelligence. But the 40 Elephants had spent decades perfecting their operational security. Their code of silence held. Informants found themselves isolated, unable to penetrate the tight-knit networks of working-class women who protected their own. The few times police thought they'd identified hoisting houses, raids produced nothing. The gang's intelligence network had warned them in advance, and goods were moved before police arrived. The fundamental problem was that Scotland Yard was fighting with outdated weapons against an enemy that had evolved beyond their comprehension. Police methods of the 1880s and 1890s relied heavily on informants, physical surveillance, and catching criminals in the act. The 40 Elephants had neutralized all three approaches. The beginning of the end came not from brilliant detective work or technological innovation, but from something the 40 Elephants couldn't control: human nature and the inevitable arrogance that success breeds. By 1895, the organization had operated with near impunity for nearly 3 decades. They'd grown wealthy, confident, and perhaps most dangerously, complacent. The rigid discipline that Mary Carr had instilled was beginning to fray as leadership passed to a new generation that hadn't experienced the hunger and desperation that built the empire. These younger leaders had known only success, and success had made them careless. The mistake that would crack the organization's foundation occurred on a crisp March afternoon at Liberty's department store on Regent Street. A team of 440 Elephants entered for what should have been a routine operation, a carefully planned theft targeting a new collection of imported French jewelry that had just arrived. The intelligence was solid, the store layout familiar, the team experienced. But one member deviated from protocol. Her name was Annie Miller, a talented lifter, but known within the gang for taking unnecessary risks. That day, emboldened by years of successful thefts and frustrated by the modest take from recent operations, she decided to push her luck. Rather than lifting the planned items and leaving, she returned for a second pass through the jewelry department, targeting additional pieces that hadn't been part of the original operation. The additional time in the store created exposure the gang's careful protocols were designed to avoid. A sharp-eyed floor supervisor named Margaret Harrison had noticed the group during their first pass. Nothing specific, just a nagging sense that something wasn't quite right about these well-dressed women. When she saw Miller return alone to the jewelry counter, that vague suspicion crystallized into certainty. Harrison didn't confront Miller directly. She'd been trained that accusations against customers could result in lawsuits and termination. Instead, She quietly alerted the store security officer and continued observing from a discreet distance. When Miller finally left the store, Harrison noted the direction she traveled and passed the description to the security officer, who made a decision that would prove fateful. He followed her. Miller, confident from decades of the gang's success, didn't execute the careful counter-surveillance protocols she'd been taught. She took a direct route toward Lambeth, heading toward one of the organization's primary hoisting houses. The security officer followed her for over a mile before alerting a passing constable, who joined the pursuit. When they finally stopped Miller on a residential street in Lambeth, the search revealed thousands of pounds worth of jewelry concealed in her modified clothing. But more damaging was where she'd been heading. The constable noted the address, and, for the first time in the 40 Elephants' history, police had direct evidence linking a major theft to a specific location in South London. Detective Inspector Jarvis received the report the following morning and recognized immediately that this was the break he'd been seeking for years. He'd maintained his investigation even as superiors dismissed his theories, accumulating files on suspected gang members and their associates. Now he had a thread he could pull, rather than raiding the Lambeth address immediately, a move that would have yielded little, as the organization's early warning system would have cleared the location before police arrived. Jarvis took a different approach. He began systematic surveillance of the building and everyone who entered or left it. He cross-referenced their faces against his files of suspected thieves. He tracked their movements, documented their associates, slowly mapping the network. Over the following months, Jarvis's investigation revealed the outline of something that stunned even him, an organization far more sophisticated than he'd imagined. The web of connections extended across London and beyond. The same women appeared near multiple theft locations. They met at specific addresses that Jarvis identified as likely operational centers. Financial transactions at local banks suggested money flowing through what appeared to be legitimate businesses. But Jarvis faced a new problem. The more he learned, the more complex the organization appeared, and the harder it became to build prosecutable cases. Surveillance alone wasn't enough. He needed witnesses, evidence, arrests that would stand up in court. And he needed to act before the gang realized they were being watched and disappeared back into the shadows. The opportunity came in December 1895, when Jarvis's surveillance team observed what appeared to be planning for a major operation. Multiple suspected gang members had gathered at a millinery shop in Southwark, one of the locations Jarvis had identified as a likely hoisting house. The meeting lasted several hours, with members arriving and departing separately, following patterns consistent with criminal coordination. Jarvis made a calculated decision. Rather than raiding the meeting, he positioned plainclothes officers at major department stores across London's West End. If his theory was correct, the gang would strike within the next few days. And this time, police would be watching specifically for female suspects working in coordinated teams. 3 days later, a team of 40 elephants entered Harrods. They executed their operation with a precision developed over decades, the customer distracting staff, the lifters working the displays, the lookout watching for threats. But this time, the threats were already inside, watching from positions the gang hadn't anticipated. 2 plainclothes officers, positioned as ordinary shoppers, observed the entire operation. They watched the distraction, saw the lifts executed with remarkable skill, noted the coordination between team members who appeared to be strangers. Rather than arresting them immediately, the officers followed them from the store, documenting their movements, watching where they went, who they met. Over the following week, Jarvis coordinated simultaneous raids on 6 locations across South London. The carefully timed operation caught the 40 elephants unprepared for the first time in their history. Police seized stolen goods, financial records, and most critically, documents that revealed the scope of the organization, membership lists, coded communications, records of operations dating back years. 17 women were arrested in the initial sweep, with more arrests following as police analyzed the seized documents. For the 40 elephants, the unthinkable had happened. Their security had been breached, their operations exposed, their leadership captured. The arrests of 1895 should have destroyed the 40 elephants. 17 members in custody, hoisting houses compromised, financial records seized. Any ordinary criminal organization would have collapsed under such devastation. But the 40 elephants weren't ordinary, and the resilience built into their structure by Mary Carr ensured that even catastrophic losses couldn't kill what she'd created. Within weeks of the raids, a new figure emerged to lead the organization through its darkest period, a woman whose name would become synonymous with the 40 elephants for decades to come, whose legend would outlive the organization itself. Alice Diamond. Alice was different from the leaders who came before her. Where Mary Carr had been strategic and cerebral, preferring manipulation and planning to confrontation, Alice brought something the organization desperately needed in its moment of crisis: raw strength and an intimidating physical presence that commanded immediate respect and fear. Born in 1896 in Lambeth, Alice grew into the gang during its golden age, learning the trade from her mother and aunts who were senior members. But Alice possessed qualities that set her apart even in an organization of exceptional women. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, towering over most men of the era, with a muscular build developed from years of hard physical labor. Her hands were reportedly so strong she could bend iron bars, and her reputation for violence became the stuff of underworld legend. But Alice was far more than simple muscle. She understood that the organization's survival required adaptation. The police now knew the 40 elephants existed. The old invisibility was gone. The methods that had worked for 30 years needed evolution, and Alice provided it. She restructured the gang's operations with military precision. Cell structures replaced the previous more interconnected model. Smaller teams that operated independently, knowing only their immediate members. If one cell was compromised, the others could continue functioning. The days of large gatherings at hoisting houses ended. Communication became more carefully controlled, with trusted couriers and coded messages replacing face-to-face meetings. Alice also understood that the organization needed to project strength during this vulnerable period. Rivals sensing weakness might move against them. Members facing prosecution might be tempted to cooperate with police for leniency. The solution was calculated intimidation, making examples that would echo through London's underworld. Her signature became razor blades concealed in the brim of her hat. In an era when women's hats featured long, sharp hatpins, Alice's modified headwear was a weapon that could be deployed in seconds. The stories of what she did to those who crossed the organization became increasingly terrifying. Rivals slashed, informants brutalized. Anyone who threatened the 40 elephants learning that Alice Diamond's justice was swift and terrible. One particular incident cemented her legend. A fence who'd worked with the organization for years decided that their moment of weakness presented an opportunity. He shortchanged them on a major sale, pocketing the difference and betting that the gang was too compromised to respond. Alice tracked him to a pub in Whitechapel, confronted him in front of dozens of witnesses, and beat him so severely that he spent weeks in hospital. She then calmly walked out, knowing that no witness would dare identify her to police. The message rippled through London's criminal underworld. The 40 elephants were wounded but far from dead, and their new leader was more dangerous than anyone who'd come before. Under Alice's leadership, the gang gradually rebuilt. She recruited aggressively, targeting young women from the same working-class neighborhoods that had always supplied members. But she raised the standards, accepting only those who demonstrated exceptional nerve, intelligence, and loyalty. The training program became even more rigorous, with Alice personally overseeing the development of new members. She also modernized the operation in ways that reflected the changing times. The late 1890s and early 1900s brought new technologies and social changes that Alice exploited brilliantly. The expansion of railway networks allowed the gang to hit targets further from London and escape more quickly. The growing women's suffrage movement provided cover. Groups of women traveling together for political meetings could actually be 40 elephants heading to a distant city for a carefully planned operation. Alice understood media in ways her predecessors hadn't. By the early 1900s, newspapers had begun reporting on the shoplifting plague affecting London's department stores. Rather than hiding from this attention, Alice subtly encouraged it, understanding that sensational stories about mysterious female thieves actually served the organization's interests. They created an aura of invincibility, made the gang seem larger and more powerful than it actually was, and most importantly, they terrified shop owners into security measures that the 40 Elephants had already learned to defeat. The trial of the 17 arrested members in 1896 became a public sensation. Newspapers filled columns with scandalized descriptions of these lady thieves, who'd operated a criminal empire for decades. But the trial also revealed the gang's continued strength. Despite police pressure and offers of leniency for cooperation, not one of the accused women testified against the others. The code of silence held absolutely. The sentences handed down were relatively light, the longest being 18 months imprisonment. Several defendants received only fines. The Victorian justice system, even confronted with evidence of organized criminal activity, couldn't quite accept that women were capable of such sophistication and thus couldn't bring itself to impose the harsh sentences that would have been automatic for male criminals. Those imprisoned emerged to find that Alice had kept her promises. Their families had been supported throughout their incarceration. Jobs were waiting for them if they chose to return to the organization. Those who wanted to retire were helped to do so with financial support that allowed them to start legitimate businesses or simply disappear into respectable obscurity. By 1900, the 40 Elephants were operating again at nearly full capacity. The hoisting houses had relocated to new addresses. The fencing networks had been rebuilt with new contacts. The training program was producing skilled thieves who learned from both the successes and mistakes of the past. And at the center of it all stood Alice Diamond, enforcer, leader, legend, guiding the organization into the 20th century. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. The 40 Elephants would continue operating for another 50 years after Alice Diamond took command, adapting to each new era with the same innovative spirit that had founded them. Through 2 world wars, the rise of modern policing, the advent of forensic science, they persisted, evolved, survived. But to understand their true legacy, we need to look beyond the crimes themselves and examine what they represented and what they ultimately became. By the 1920s, the gang had reached a kind of equilibrium with law enforcement. Police knew they existed, had files on suspected members, occasionally made arrests. But the 40 Elephants had become an institution, woven so deeply into the fabric of South London's working-class communities that rooting them out completely proved impossible. They provided employment, supported families, offered opportunities to women who had few other options for economic advancement in a society that systematically limited their choices. The First World War paradoxically strengthened their operations. With men away fighting and women taking on new roles in factories and offices, female mobility increased dramatically. Women traveling alone or in groups no longer drew the same attention they once had. The social changes the war accelerated, women's suffrage, new fashions that allowed for easier movement, changing attitudes about women's capabilities, all worked in the gang's favor. Alice Diamond refined the organization throughout the 1920s and 1930s, transforming it into something that would have been recognizable to modern organized crime scholars. She established territories, negotiated agreements with other criminal organizations, diversified their operations beyond simple theft. The 40 Elephants moved into protection rackets, illegal gambling operations, even bootlegging during the years when Britain experimented with restrictive alcohol licensing. But the core operation remained shoplifting, and their methods continued to evolve with the times. As stores implemented new security measures, the gang adapted. When cameras appeared in stores, they learned to avoid them or exploit their blind spots. When security guards became more common, they developed new distraction techniques. When stores began using tag merchandise, they found ways to remove tags without triggering alarms. The Second World War brought new challenges and opportunities. Rationing created black markets, where the 40 Elephants fencing networks thrived. Bombed-out buildings provided new hiding places and operational bases. The chaos of wartime London allowed them to operate with even greater impunity as police resources focused on civil defense and war-related crime. By the late 1940s, Alice Diamond was aging, and a new generation was taking control. The post-war world was changing rapidly. The department stores that had been their primary targets for 70 years were transforming. New retail models emerged. Suburbs sprawled. Consumer culture exploded. And slowly, the old methods that had worked for generations became less effective. The 1950s marked the beginning of the end. Modern security systems, electronic tags, sophisticated camera networks, computerized inventory tracking made the old techniques increasingly risky. The tight-knit working-class communities that had protected the gang were breaking up, dispersed by urban renewal and suburban migration. The code of silence that had been absolute began to crack as younger members, arrested with more sophisticated evidence against them, chose cooperation over loyalty. The last major operation attributed to the 40 Elephants occurred in 1956, a coordinated hit on multiple stores that netted goods worth nearly £50,000. But the subsequent investigation, using modern forensic techniques and coordinated multi-jurisdictional policing, resulted in dozens of arrests. This time, several members did cooperate with authorities, and the convictions carried real prison time, years rather than months. Alice Diamond died in 1952, taking with her much of the institutional knowledge and force of personality that had held the organization together. Without her leadership, the remaining members fragmented. Some retired. Others formed smaller, independent operations. A few continued using the 40 Elephants name through the 1960s, but they were shadows of what the organization had been. Petty criminals trading on a reputation they hadn't earned. So what is the legacy of the 40 Elephants? On one level, they were simply criminals. Thieves who stole millions of pounds worth of goods over nearly a century of operation. But they were also something more complex and, in its way, almost progressive. They proved that women were capable of the same organizational sophistication, strategic thinking, and criminal ambition as men, a demonstration that challenged Victorian society's fundamental assumptions about gender and capability. They built a support network that helped working-class women survive in an economy that offered them few legitimate opportunities. They passed skills and knowledge across generations, creating something that transcended individual lifetimes. Modern organized crime borrowed extensively from the 40 Elephants' innovations, often without knowing the source. The cell structure that terrorist and criminal organizations now use, the 40 Elephants pioneered it. The sophisticated money laundering through legitimate businesses, they were doing it in the 1880s. The use of female couriers and operatives precisely because law enforcement underestimates women, that playbook was written in Victorian London. Law enforcement also learned from them. The recognition that organized crime could take forms beyond violent male gangs, that it could operate through legitimate-seeming businesses, that it required patient investigation and intelligence gathering rather than simple brute force. These insights came partly from the decades-long struggle to combat the 40 Elephants. Today, if you walk through Elephant and Castle, now a neighborhood undergoing yet another transformation, with modern apartments replacing the old Victorian terraces, there's almost nothing to mark what once existed there. No plaques commemorate the 40 Elephants. No museums preserve their story. The hoisting houses have been demolished or converted beyond recognition. The women who built and ran this criminal empire have been largely erased from history. Perhaps that's fitting. They spent their lives avoiding documentation, maintaining secrecy, operating in shadows. They succeeded precisely because they were invisible, because history overlooked them, because no one believed women capable of what they accomplished. But their story deserves to be remembered, not celebrated, certainly, but acknowledged. They were products of their time, shaped by poverty and limited opportunities, who chose a criminal path that harmed others. But they were also brilliant innovators who built something unprecedented and maintained it across generations through intelligence, discipline, and an understanding of human psychology that was decades ahead of its time. The 40 Elephants proved that the greatest crimes aren't always committed by the most visible criminals. Sometimes they're executed by those society refuses to see, until it's far too late, before the Mafia, before the mob, before organized crime became synonymous with violence and glamorized in countless films and television shows. There were the 40 Elephants, a network of working-class women who built an empire in the shadows and changed criminal history forever. Their time has passed, but their legacy remains, hidden in plain sight, just as they always preferred it.